All right, thank you for coming today. Stand here. I'm a visiting scholar working with Izzy on UArctic network of collaborative online international learning, but this presentation is more based on the work that I do. And so I wanted to share a little bit of that with you all. I presented also last Wednesday, but the same one. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I've been working on this relationships before research for a long time. We have a long history of helicopter research. We have a long history of a separation of what a scientist is versus a community member. And it creates a lot of issues in the work itself, but also post-work, how the community is feeling and whether they're open to additional work. So I introduce myself as who I identify, which is I first identify as a person and a woman, an Indigenous woman and a wife, a daughter, an aunt. The largest part of my life is revolving around that. My work, I'm an Indigenous studies graduate. I do sustainability science. And I largely respond to what tribal or Indigenous need is. There's not a lot of Alaska Native PhDs. I was number 115, so we have about maybe 160 now. And so largely when I'm contacted for need, whether it's research, evaluation, or technical assistance such as grant writing, I find a way to support the communities that I work with. I'm a co-chair for the planning process, the International Congress on Arctic Research Planning. We're planning for the upcoming International Polar Year. That's the Sustainable Community Priority 3, and we'll be finishing that up this fall and presenting it next spring, the priorities, recommended funding priorities. And I'm also visiting here to then go on to Finland. I'm a Fulbright Arctic scholar. My work looks largely at Indigenous land management, leadership in land management, and the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in decision-making around land and water management. And so I'm kind of talking from a lot of that work perspective, as well as, how to work in Indigenous-led research, community-led research, and what that looks like. So which guides my work is, like I said, responding to community need largely. This comes from the women in my family. The women in my family have largely been culture bearers and also have raised the children. This is a picture of my great-great-grandmother, Ella Kaguna. It's the first picture we have in our family, the oldest picture we have in the Inupiaq side of our family. And then my great-grandmother, Margaret Becker, and then my grandmother, Mary Jean Kaguna Yenny, and then the last one I'm with my mom and also my grandmother's last surviving sibling, Velma, who lives in Anchorage. And I really try to do work that honors ancestral relationships, but builds a space for youth to continue this work. We have a lot of separation in our tribal communities where our leadership is in the 70s, 70 years old, and trying to bring young people into that space and wanting to be in that space. I also want to honor that Indigenous land management has allowed a lot of sustainable management in Alaska, in the US, and largely across the planet. And also I live part-time in the US South, so also recognizing inequities in bringing slave populations over to South Carolina, but how those populations have adapted and managed the land themselves as well. So this presentation really emphasizes that when we enter a community that it's important to seek to understand before seeking to be understood. So entering as a listener instead of entering as considering we're the expert, but recognizing that communities are the expert and that we're ultimately there to learn from who we're talking to. So the idea is a switch from that academic expert position, which is often how we have to enter these rooms, being prepared for the typical, I have a comment followed by a question, which is often a challenge of your work in the US, to coming in with humility and centering that desire to learn, the desire to have empathy and embrace difference. And so my talk centers that what we can learn from both difference and the realization that as human beings with families, we have more in common than we actually do have different. So starting with what cultural humility, which is where a lot of the framing has moved in the United States. We used to talk a lot about cultural competence, kind of an assumption that you can actually become fully competent in someone else's culture. I've been married into a Kenyan Kisi family for over 13 years, and I'm most definitely not even remotely competent in their culture, let alone language at all, no matter the efforts or learnings I strive to do and the daily life I lead. So it's this idea that we enter a lifelong process when we engage with other communities, whether in our family or work. And it also challenges the notion, which is kind of quite embedded in nonprofits, at least in the United States, that as researchers, we're coming in to save these communities, that they don't know how to do it themselves. Kind of ignoring the fact that their land has been taken, ways to make money have been taken, and it might be more of those issues that have caused a lack of what may seem as capacity to deal with one's own issues or build the way that a community wants to build. Also, I think part of recognizing difference and similarity is that we all have different backgrounds. There's a tendency to walk into a community and forgetting that we have all these different aspects of identity that give a specific lens that we enter a community and look at a community through. And that if you think of that, just even someone here has a completely different lens than you, which you might even face in a discussion, in a course, or in a professional discussion. But that if you layer an extensively different history or cultural background, that lens is even more different. That can change the ability to understand one another and just make it take more time, I would say, to understand one another. So I really emphasize that discomfort is an opportunity to grow, and that being comfortable with being uncomfortable is a fantastic experience. Sitting in a community, whether it's food you're uncomfortable about eating, whether it's the way you might have to change how you dress, all of these things to be acting what is considered appropriate in the area you're in can make us uncomfortable. But at the same time, we can enter and make a lot of other people uncomfortable too. And so it's just creating that space as a guest. Ultimately, we're guests when we enter another community to do work. And so on top of all these differences, we also have this idea of power. When we enter a community, previously having won funding, we come with all the money. That creates a massive power differential. We also have a long history of communities who have been marginalized or minoritized, saying that in a way, instead of this is a minority community, saying that they have actually been minoritized based on whether it's slavery, based on colonization, based on diseases brought. There's a whole lot of reasons if we think of the agency that went into creating a difficult space for people. And so when we enter with power and we enter with privilege, that's important to reflect on ourselves. And it's also important to reflect that from their perspective, you might not be the most privileged person in the room, even if we feel that way. And so just a constant idea of looking at our positionality. Where are we when we're in the room? And this extends way more beyond the relationship. How are you analyzing data? Is it even possible for you to analyze data about another culture and community yourself? Or do you need to bring community members in? Do you need to follow up interviews with focus groups so that you workshop your data to better understand what you're seeing? For me personally, even working with a community 40 minutes from where I grew up, I couldn't interpret the data correctly without their support. So the idea is that when we work with communities, it's an allyship. We're trying to support, we're trying to learn, And that this is, I love the ladder of empowerment. It talks about, where are you in your learning process to ultimately be someone who can support. And that, it's difficult to work through being called out or recognizing who we are. I grew up in an Inupiaq family, raising reindeer, knowing who I was. I entered Southern California and I was seen as like just a wealthy white kid, regardless of not having wealth or anything. And I had to deal with the understanding of white privilege and all of that, which I actually didn't have any of that where I was from. Being Native in Alaska, you have the opposite. And so that was a big learning experience for me, a challenging of who I was by other people, and growing through that and learning more about being in spaces. In Alaska, we didn't have a lot of Latino populations, Asian populations, Black populations from a very small town of 5,000 people. So it was a big learning experience and confronting myself and ultimately choosing to major in race and ethnic studies out of that experience. So because my talk is kind of based around the US, I just want to share a little bit of perspective. I know even this is not taught in US history classes, but it is the history of the United States. So I'll share a little bit about that so you understand the context of where I'm speaking from. So settler colonialism is an ongoing thing in the United States. We didn't necessarily have people come and then go. But also when people came due to diseases, genocide, and massacres, we did have a massive population loss of millions of people. So we are now 2.9% of the population. That includes American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islander populations, which are from U.S. territories, American Samoa, and Guam. And then also we have Caribbean populations, Carib people and Taino people from Puerto Rico that are usually not counted. It's a whole thing of what counts as being indigenous in the United States. But so we went through a whole period of assimilation after genocide and massacres trying to reduce the population. It was then how can we fix this population to be civilized? And so we had a boarding school era stemming from the 1800s. In Alaska, it didn't end until 1980. Was the last government-run boarding school. It had a whole host of terrible experiences, including instead of children going home in the summer to stay connected to their family, culture, and language, they were actually kind of sold out to white families to either be a housekeeper if it was a female child, and to work on a farm if it was a male child. So we've been sending them to the lower 48 or the contiguous U.S. Slavery in Alaska lasted until the 1960s, way out on an Aleutian island, obviously way past the Emancipation Proclamation and all of those things that happened in the U.S. South. But we had a form of indentured servitude that lasted well into the 1900s. And then we have issues of removal. I was talking to Rachel on the way over about starvation. Russian colonizers in Alaska killed many of our fur mammals in the sea. And then American colonizers killed whales and walrus. So it resulted in a loss of all the food that people ate. So starvation issues, which also made population a switch of power and dependency. Then we have ongoing things. Sterilizations happened into the 70s, involuntary sterilizations if people were giving birth in a hospital. And then we have modern things like repatriation from museums, even in Europe, as we're trying to get back family remains. So very ongoing. Climate change is also considered a link to colonization from capitalistic economic extraction. So what has this done? And I extend this well beyond the U.S. That this has affected populations around the world that have experienced colonization. This is a really unique diagram that shows that as you have traumatic events, which are on the side next to me here, starting with disease, like I said, leading to warfare, loss of land, you see that those impacts are passed down to generation and also across generations. So intra and inter. It changed parenting practices, it changed languages, it changed culture, clothes, norms, And then you see, due to that, you have an increase as you go down of cumulative stress, increasing and increasing, and it starts to be actually physical. You have poverty, you have substance use, and you have increasing marginalization, so movement into specific communities. And that increased an adoption of unhealthy behavior and also a reduction in health overall. And so we talk about historical trauma having this not only physical effects, but emotional and psychological effects. It actually has been shown to have epigenetic changes to DNA over time, and that it causes, changes in ability to deal with different situations, but also, things like poverty are very difficult to come out of. And then when it becomes like totally tribal wide, now it's even more difficult. And so we see adverse conditions that result at the individual level, maybe substance use, at the family level, maybe poverty, and then at the community level, lack of healthcare, hospital services. And in the U.S. also, because we have ongoing settler colonialism, you have land loss. So in the picture of the contiguous U.S., this is as we have, manifest destiny, westward expansion. And then we have reservations formed, which were like areas that were considered native land, which were still consistently given to farmers, as you can see from the late 1800s to the 1900s. And so now we have a great reduction of land. In Alaska, it went from, full all of Alaska to only the bright orange population, colored areas. And those are held largely by corporations. It was a different land claims model. All the land was taken from the tribes. It was put in this corporate model. It's an experiment to see if that would work better with poverty. Mixed options, mixed outcomes. But then even though it looks like there's these squares of land, if you go over, it's actually checkerboarded. So within the Alaska orange things, maybe 10 acres is owned by the native corporations. It might be next to 10 acres of state land, 10 acres of federal land through the Bureau of Land Management. So you can't actually put a fence around that orange area and say that this is ours and this is how I want to manage it, because it's checkerboarded, which creates, that was obviously, there was a reason for that. It weakened the ability to have ownership or control, even though those weren't cultural practices and how land was related to. Just to expand, to show it's not just the US, obviously, we had the Berlin Conference in Africa, which changed this like massive pattern of overlapping and trading and interrelating indigenous nations, tribes, into dividing it into rule and ownership by different European nations, which then drew, country boundaries. And so we have a country like Kenya that has 40 tribes within it, trying to negotiate how we run government. If a person from one tribe is elected president, what does that mean to the other tribes? So in the US, while we have a strong tribal identity, in Kenya, they try to not promote tribalism so that everybody can get along. In the US, we still come together because we have a larger government against us. So it's just these really different situations. To help understand US perspectives in research, I'm not sure entirely how this is talked about here, but in the US, there was this big move that we need to look at racial equity in research, because of course in the US, we have white populations are almost the minority. So there's been a lot of research on what racism is and how it affects people. It has individual components, there's structural components, and of course it's embedded in institutions. In our government, if you've been watching anything in the US about the gerrymandering happening to reduce the power of minoritized people during elections, things like that, that would be more institutional. But the problem is when we try to adapt it to indigenous communities are quite different than other racialized communities in the US because they still maintain sovereignty. It's a government within a government. They have direct government relations to speak to the United States federal government, to speak to the states. And that's just a really different perspective. So what does that mean when you're working with a sovereign government? It would be like working with this government. be like working with the US federal government. And that really changes who owns the data, who has power. And it also is important to recognize, the historical trauma, and that really changes how you might work with individuals. If you look at the book by Linda Smith, a Maori woman from New Zealand, she talks about that Indigenous research should really be about promoting that community's self-determination and what that community wants, centering Indigenous rights, their ownership of the research. And yeah, so when you work with Indigenous communities to have an equitable approach, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of things to consider. So I just try to emphasize that difference. Also, what I mean by codified racism, in the US, Indigenous people, only American Indians and Alaska Natives, still carry cards of blood quantum. So we carry a card that says 1/4 blood, 1/8 blood, full blood. Those were used historically to say if you were full blood, you couldn't make decisions yourself because you didn't have the mental capacity. Now they're used as a way to access services, but they're also used as a way to track who people are and things like that. And it wasn't a traditional practice. We intermarried and adopted, and so tribes weren't decided by blood quantum ever before. So as we see control of land, which has resulted in control of different things that are extracted from the land, which has brought a ton of wealth, we also see that there was control in the boarding schools of what is knowledge, what is culture. And so the concept of epistemicide was introduced to me in South Africa. The idea that you can colonize power and what are resources, you can colonize physical bodies, but you can also colonize knowledge and develop and share in research that there's one methodology, there's one type of science, Western science, and that is going to guide everything. And of course, when you work in an Indigenous community, this approach is going to really challenge your ability to have a relationship. So what's a different way to think about it? Tuck and Yang have this great article which addresses decolonization, that it can't be a metaphor. And they talk very physically about, even though research might not involve land back, is there a self-determination aspect of it? Since my work is largely about relationships, I talk about, can it actually change your mindset and approach? Instead of just be this idea, like it's thrown around a lot in the US, let's decolonize education, let's decolonize this system. And so more recent literature has talked about, let's indigenize a system that hasn't had that before, or let's re-indigenize land management. Sami people are talking a lot about that and applying that to US national parks. And so I talk about what might that look like? How can we even conceptualize that somebody can come from a completely different approach than us? Well, I would say that everybody in this room comes from a completely different approach, that we all have our own clover per se. Depends on how you understand the world. Are you Christian? Are you Muslim? Are you Jewish? Are you atheist? Do you believe in the Big Bang Theory? All of that changes what you consider knowledge and science. All of that changes how you believe people should be, and it changes your ethics and value system, which inform your action. So our lives are largely informed by these structures. Yet when we enter institutions of higher learning, we all kind of accept that there's only one of those. So as educators, especially here, as I hear that there's actually a department on pedagogy, which we do not have things like that at home. You're just a professor, you're just unleashed. Having this idea of that we should recognize these type of differences, and it might actually change how you support one student versus another. Not just talking about, neurotypical people and neurodivergent people, different ways of learning, but that there's actually different bases of thinking, that instead of just mixed methods, we have mixed methodologies. And so just, again, addressing kind of Indigenous knowledge as if I can lump them all together, which I can't, but giving general principles of how it's a little bit different. It tends to be based on observations that are passed down kind of in a specific place where people actually lived, very place-based, very oral. Many Indigenous languages were shared only orally, not written down. of course, like any culture, it's dynamic and growing. It's often talked about traditional knowledge, and that often is a difficult term to use because people think that means it's like old, but it's just as built upon day to day like any system. It's really kinship based. So when you look at land management like I do, it's all about reciprocal nurturance. So it's recognition, like in this model by COIL, that you have the human realm, you have a natural realm, which is called also non-human kin. And then you have a spiritual realm, which is more than human kin. So things we don't understand, particularly around cosmology and spirituality. And that these realms, in addition to epistemologies, ontologies, and axiologies, guide our way of knowing. Or I know knowing sounds like epistemology, but it guides our beings, our values, our whole approach, our life ways. Kyle White doesn't like the word worldviews, but that's also used quite a bit. He's an indigenous philosopher from the United States and activist and environmentalist. So I find that terminology can even start things off not on a great foot. So this one's based on health. But for example, when you work in environmental spaces, if you come in talking to community about their natural resources, and you're talking about resource extraction when you're talking about natural resources, I just explained that those are considered non-human kin to Indigenous communities. So that's going to be a difficult conversation. That's going to start off on the wrong foot right away. If one perspective is to dominate and take, and one perspective is to care for and share. Same thing can happen in health spaces. This was for a presentation on tribal assistance for needy families, tribal temporary assistance for needy families, where like the idea of child care assistance often is not extended to extended family care. We have a lot of grandparent parents now, and that has gone through a whole challenge and shift in the federal system of, can our grandparents' parents, can we give support to them to raise children? Also, entering the workforce, employment is seen as very individualistic in broader culture. In communities, if you are like the hunter hunting for like 7 families, that's a hugely important role. And instead of everybody going to employment here, people might have divided roles that then as a sharing network all support each other. So just traditional forms of, for us in the US, of like what's considered a federal program doesn't really fit community organization. And so, like I said, knowing yourself, knowing your positionality. I like to challenge objectivity as a myth because we just talked about the lens you come from. So being reflexive, being intentional, knowing who you are and knowing who your position is as you enter a space really recognizes honestly that you have biases. It's not bad. Everybody does. We have stereotypes, we have biases, helps us live in this world and make decisions more quickly. But it also can cause difficulty with relationship building. Being reflexive means that you're willing to reflect on how your own beliefs might influence you and how you're interacting with other people. And then when you extend that to Indigenous perspectives, you come into a relational space. Once you can be reflexive on yourself, how now can you engage with other people within their cultural system? I know these are like complex diagrams that are fun to look at, and I'm just gently covering them, but they are cool, and there are resources at the bottom, and I'll give you my sources at the end. So where we've been moving into, there's a lot of talk about co-production of knowledge. That's very much a buzzword right now, that together, maybe a scientist and a community create new knowledge. However, pushing back a little on that is can you come to a community trying to already understand that there's multiple ways of knowing? A Micmac perspective is the idea of two-eyed seeing, that you can think from a Western perspective and an Indigenous perspective. So you might have 2 of those clovers that now are trying to overlay or interact with one another. We take that now beyond that. We talk about pluralism and heterogeneity, that we can recognize that there's an infinite number of clovers that have to be considered, that there's all kinds of knowledge interacting, and then it actually gives you much better data and helps you make better decisions. There's a scholar, Merle Ballard, in Canada who's talking right now about three-eyed seeing, that you have a Western perspective, an Indigenous perspective, and then you have the perspective of non-human kin. So are we considering that in this space? I just literally read that last night. But I found it intriguing because I've been talking a lot about pluralism, which talks more about human perspectives, but recognizes many. But do we have a representative, in the rights of nature movement for the natural world? So being open to this. This is a framework. This is complex as I try to share what pluralism looks like. I've been working in the space more of philosophy of science and science diplomacy, not in the traditional science diplomacy sense, but more as an Indigenous person. What does it look like when I engage in science diplomacy, which is this talk right now in this room? I'm trying to bring this idea that we have this Indigenous clover. Again, it's very different for everybody, but if we kind of try and create general ideas, we might have a more Euro-American perspective. And are we able to bridge those to actually have better information? We run into a lot of issues, though. It's difficult to communicate between knowledge systems. We don't even have the right words, like I shared earlier. There's aspects of science communication which most researchers aren't even trained in. Can you even talk to a normal person can you talk to your grandmother or your mother about your work? That is step one. And then can you talk to a community from a totally different culture about your work? We have a lot of disciplinary siloing, which is really impacting the ability to build science. And then we have to span value systems and power structures. And so why do we do all that? The idea is to create a different idea of who has epistemic authority in decision making. Can we have epistemic justice of Indigenous minoritized people being able to be in these spaces, not just as within the culture that they're assimilating to, but bringing their own selves to that space? So this kind of talks about what does it look like to have sustainable planetary health and a pluralism of perspectives in decision making. And the idea is that we draw on decolonizing and anti-racist approaches. This is the book that by Linda Smith that I had mentioned earlier, 1999. She has a new one that came out, I think, in 2010. She also, of course, has a lot of new chapters in other people's books. And she's edited a book as well. I also encourage you to look at the work of her husband, Graham. Graham Smith writes off of kind of Freire's approach of conscientization. Can we bring this movement of a change in consciousness in a community that has had such mass assimilation and colonization to make self-determining decisions? And so you see the movement in New Zealand with creating 100 PhDs or whatever their goal was, that was one of those movements, that they brought their own knowledge into the academy. It totally changed what that looks like. In research, it looks like who owns it. Did we consult before even writing the grant? Who's carrying out the work? Are we actually engaging local young people and interviewing, not just for them to make some money, but it actually will help us understand more. In the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, free, prior, and informed consent was formalized. The idea is that, honestly, this should be for anyone in research, is that, you can freely consent without intimidation or force. You should be able to consent prior to the project starting or the extraction. This was largely also based around extraction of natural, of oil or minerals. Can you be informed about everything that's going to happen? So in regards to minerals and things, are there going to be those like poison ponds that tend to leak into groundwater? Or for communities, are we doing some type of project that actually involves radiation? Like in the Alaska, there was a thyroid radiation study that ended up causing cancer and issues in people because they weren't informed that that's what it did. And then are we going to create a space where people could say yes or no, and also even say no halfway through, or even say no after all the data is collected and we want to release it? The answer is still no. Are we going to respect that space? The withdrawal at any time is difficult as a researcher, so it's important to think about all of that up front. And, the things that create all these issues with consent is like past treaties that have been broken, We also have that it's difficult in Indigenous communities because you have a sovereign government. So you have to seek consent of the government before you seek consent of individuals to engage in research. And then in the US, some tribes have institutional review boards, just like a university. Some tribes make decisions as a tribal council, but then you're also required to go through your university IRB. So there's layers of consent. You can sometimes have 3 levels of consent if you also have to do a federal health, the Indian Health Service as well. So there's this whole process, and it can mostly be determined by asking. That's always the best approach. The fair data movement came out a lot of the internet. That data should be, available and reusable. But added to that, an Indigenous perspective that data should also be beneficial. That who controls the data, who's responsible for it. There's been some great work out of Stephanie Carroll and her group around Global Data Alliance, and they've really started to dive into what it looks like. Because a lot of what I'm talking about just based on time today is principles, and I hate giving principles because you don't know what it means. What does it look like? What do you actually do? And so this whole talk is based on a paper that I wrote called Research in a Good Way, where it actually walks you through. I took the principles I learned from my master's research, and then I tried to apply it for my dissertation. So what did I actually do? What were the problems that I encountered? What did we learn? Also, drawing on asset-based approaches. In Indigenous communities, there's a lot of ability based on historical trauma to recognize a lot of negative things. There's substance use issues, there's lack of healthcare, there's lack of running water, there's all these lacks. Often for communities, they kind of already know that. And documenting that in research can be somewhat useful for policy change if people don't realize that's not there. But it's usually not very useful to the participants. So for example, I've heard research presentations where they counted the number of substance abusers in a community. That really did nothing for the community, but as a demographer, that was really important to them. From a community perspective, it might be much more important to talk about people who have recovered from alcoholism or people who have abstained from alcohol completely. Why have they done that? What allowed them to recover? Because that's actually useful to address other people who are struggling. I use alcohol as an easy example. I'm an alcoholic. I haven't drank since 2010, but it's an easy thing to draw on because it's heavy, heavy, heavy in our communities, and it's a big challenge as we lose culture, as we lose our subsistence and traditional hunting practices. If you look at any community, if you look at rural Scottish island communities, as people have to move to the mainland, as people lose their families and their traditional practices, you see people going through a lot of struggles, disconnected. And so that leads to talking about culture as a protective factor. I really don't believe this is only for Indigenous people. I believe this is a strong part of well-being for everybody. Knowing who we are, our language, our culture, it supports our traditional practices. There's hunting, there's sewing, there's dancing, there's all kinds of traditional things that tie us to our ancestors and make us proud of our identity. If you look at research on identity loss, which is directly connected to colonization and different removal or people having to move from rural areas, you see a lot of health decline. Intergenerational connectedness, being connected to grandparents and elders, learning that knowledge, knowing your language, and really understanding how all these things are connected to worldviews or cosmologies or cosmographies, the relationship between humans and the natural world around them, which is really specific to which place people are from. And something I've heard around here as well. People are very connected to place. And that's the relationships we have with the lands and waters. And so in participatory research, we consider all of those things. In Indigenous communities, but in any community I've talked to, people say nothing about us without us. Why are things coming in and happening to us? It's been so many years of that. This is a great paper showing levels of community participation from considering the community members only kind of contractors to inform you or rent you a house to stay in, all the way to centering an Indigenous process. But I would even flip this. What does it look like when a research is a contractor? When a community puts out a request for proposals to have someone come in and gather some data and analyze it for them. So it can also be shifted where the community can be in control, and maybe that creates even more indigenization of the process. But the idea is, that there's different levels of partnership. And while this may look like that's the most positive, you also sometimes have communities that don't want to be involved in analyzing the data, in writing up the results. And that's okay too. It's honestly listening to what is desired. There are so many forms of participatory research. That's why I just use the word participatory. Community-based participatory research, participatory action research, tribally driven participatory research. All of these in principle, when they were first created, speak really of true participation, but how they've been used over the years has often really changed. So it's really participatory to the amount the community would like. And the idea based on Smith, of course, is that it's mutually beneficial, and that it can sustain relationships. I've met a few researchers who have worked with one community for the entire 30-year career they've had. That's not a lack of data or interest. They've just addressed each community question as it arises. So the next question comes up, they write a grant for that one. And so it's never exhausted, that it's no longer an interesting community, but they're answering the questions the community has come up with, one after another after another. And this is someone working with a community of under 500 people. This model came out of the Arctic in Alaska, but it's trying to understand what co-production of knowledge looks like. Again, I have some thoughts, like I've told you before, about this term, but the idea is, again, kind of a principle and trying to explain what it looks like in practice, that you might define a problem or what I call a current community condition, because it's usually current and can be changed. Identify a question together. This kind of takes you through the steps of trying to do everything together with these larger things that your research is hopefully trying to respect and lift up as it goes. This is a great paper by Yua and all, and it's in the references as well. And so research and evaluation in a good way. This is a recent paper that we came out with that trying to really center what that looks like. This is, again, very principle-based, but this is the paper that describes what the principles look like in practice, but that there's key aspects of research, key parts of Indigenous knowledge, and key principles that all together create this space that can work in a good way. And this is based off of the original model. This is when I interviewed Arctic researchers and talked to Indigenous Greenlanders. And this was the model that came out of that the biggest concern of everybody was trust. It wasn't accomplishing the research. It wasn't the data. It wasn't the analysis. It was trust is absolutely hands down what has to happen. And that it starts with doing your homework before you even come, knowing community history. Develops having a local contact so someone can teach you how to communicate, how to act. Greenlanders emphasize good manners more than respect, because they said good manners is the how of communicating. And if you don't have someone local working with you, you obviously can struggle with what good manners is supposed to be. And so this is kind of this process of what was identified as important, and it's what I tried practicing during my dissertation, and it worked rather well. But, all of these terms can mean something different to the community you're working with, and that's so important to talk about. The biggest thing is doing your part, doing your homework. Oftentimes, it's expected that a community can understand, Westernization based on colonization, but there wasn't an effort to go in and understand Indigenous methodologies before we came. And so it's just like another discipline. Did you take an Indigenous methodologies class just like you took a Western research class? Did you take an Indigenous methods class just like you took a Western methods class? requires the same amount of study and time. And if it's not offered at your university, it requires more diligence. And there has been the 4 R's of research, which changed to the 5 R's of research and is now the 7 R's of research. And so there's lots of papers on this. These are, again, a list of principles that have been described in various papers. And then I have a lot of ethics resources that I can point to. I'm just going to click through these for the recording. This is the paper the talk is based on. I'll give you my website at the end, which has a student resources section with all the ethical principles. Then there's a lot of citations that went into this talk because this talk has been developed over multiple years. And yeah, everything is available on my website pretty much. But Koyana, thank you so much.
Any questions?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, that went a little bit long.
So much information to absorb and think about as well.
First of all, I'm just so excited to be here today. Thank you, Izzy, for arranging this. Thank you for coming. I decided to do so many times for my PhD that I was just so excited to finish it in person.
Oh my goodness.
And visiting EY's next book, absolutely amazing. So it's lovely to see a lot of the stuff that I'm putting into my research is what you put. So that's very reassuring for me. So I just want to say thank you, because that's a huge amount of work that's gone in just to make, each slide. So thank you. I guess my question is, I'm a year and a bit into my PhD on decolonial participatory research with global heritage women in Scotland. So looking at Black women, Asian women, and from mixed heritage background. So I'm looking at two I'm seeing, because I feel like I'm part kind of Western, part non-Western myself. So that very much aligns with my worldviews. Now, the problem that I have with just Western research paradigms in general, very problematic in general, there's lots of colonial methodologies. But in terms of the fact that as a PhD student, I need to demonstrate that I've used the framework and I put it in I find that very extractivist. I find it very appropriation type practice. I have a problem with every single part of my research, which I know everybody does. Everybody does. But in terms of that colonial piece, what I'm thinking of doing is adapting it. Perhaps taking some of the principles, but then looking at global heritage women that we have in Scotland. We have lots of Polish people in Aberdeen, lots of Syrian refugees, etc. And then adapting it to our own needs and then putting that into my research rather than directly quoting and citing, Elder Alberts to I'm seeing in my research. So any advice that you have generally around how to go about this when perhaps your supervisory team not familiar with any of this intergenerational trauma, restorative practice, extractive, etc. I would really appreciate your advice as career research.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So for my dissertation, also no methodology or no method fit, working within multiple methodologies. So what I ended up doing was like bringing a lot of them to the community myself, and we just discussed. I ended up using a version of ethnographic futures research. So a more indigenized version of that, which required specific requirements by the tribal council to conduct it in a way that was appropriate for the community. So I cited, I drew on theory of Freire, Memmi, and Fanon, so early decolonial scholars, to try and inform how this method, like the idea of adapting this method was okay, and then talked about how it was changed, drawing on, a very long list of Indigenous theorists as well. Another way I support, I advise students, I don't really teach, but I advise students. And so one of my students is very interested in pelvic trauma research. And so for her, she had different types of ideas, but she didn't know what ultimately is the correct ethical approach for that community. And so her whole project is on developing the appropriate method to even work with that community. So I caution you as a dissertator to not bite off 7 dissertations, which can happen really easily. And, even developing a methodology to work with can then launch your research career to work with that population in a way that feels better. And that is what they want as well. So, sometimes we have to, I guess, take that time. And my whole master's was only developing how to build a relationship appropriately. So I had lots of questions, but they just had to wait. So I guess I would say there's a few different ways to do it, and some are more time consuming than others. And it depends both what you're willing to do, but both what is appropriate for the people you're working with. And sometimes just asking, is the best approach. So I guess you can modify what exists. You can start from a baseline, or you can really try to develop what works. I hope that's helpful.
Helpful because we're going down the kinship side of things and looking at what brings all of us as women and different heritages together, and adapting frameworks. What you've said is reassuring because that's kind of down the line we're going. Also, what you said is reassuring that I feel like my project has gone back a few steps from what the supervisory team had put out in that they wanted a toolkit of how do you engage with global heritage women in public health like area. And I've gone back a few steps and I'm looking at, well, actually, let's start, how do we build trust, how do we power share? So we're going back all those steps. So I feel like I'm behind the expectations of where they think I should be, whereas I'm trying to show them that actually we need to start. So it's reassuring to hear your journey with your master's. So thank you.
Yeah, it's good to speak. Global Scholar program, we've been spending quite a lot of time talking about how to build relationships, particularly if I'm going to be going to Greenland to do research. I've got a huge learning curve and so much groundwork to cover before I can even start to really formulate any kind of questions. So a lot of time is being spent on the methodological approach and building relationships.
I'll also share that there are newer, very new methods out, Indigenous methods, which are, I don't know if you've read Margaret Kovach's book. So I could give you a list of additional reading materials to help frame the methodology perspective, but the most recent methods that have been written about that I've been drawing on, and that now they're published, you can draw on them, right? Now they exist in the real world. We have visiting methodology, that going to people's houses and visiting is a method. It's a traditional Indigenous method of data collection. We have yarning that comes out of Australia, story making. And then we have conversational conversational methods. And so I have a list I've been curating as I find these papers. I have different search alerts that come up and send me papers that I've been collecting. But so I could give you a list of the books of the methodology background and then these newer methods as well.
Any other questions? Just ask something. So this is sort of relatively new to me. I've got involved through Leila's research. So my background is more into professional education, collaborative practice. But from what I can sort of see, this all involves quite a lot of time in building. Yes. So how does that link to the structures in place when it comes to grant funding, which really don't align with this approach? Could you share some of your experience with that?
Yeah, so the master's project actually came out of interning at the National Science Foundation and a strong researcher pushback that we need preliminary funds, even small eager grants or something for $5,000 to just go visit and stay and get to know people so that you can develop a grant together, which is often expected by the funder but impossible by the researcher. So that developed the master's work, but again, that is time consuming and it does require the pre-funding. Later, we see the National Science Foundation developing what's called a developmental or an early grant, but I've been a reviewer on that grant and we don't award them unless you have the relationship. Because if you read a bunch of grants, some people are like, I would like, $500,000 because I think that I'm going to visit these communities that I read about and they might be interested in what I do. And that's so hard to fund. And so I really like the idea of the small grants and seeing that there's intramural funding here, which doesn't exist in very many places. It's mostly external, and it's very hard to get external funding. So I agree, it is time consuming. And some of the ways to take like semi-shortcuts are to work through someone who's already worked there. So do you have someone who can introduce you? Most communities have worked with some type of researcher or institution or public health system. It doesn't matter if it's public health instead of education. Is there a way that that public health person trusts you enough to put themselves on the line with that community and introduce you? And so that's kind of how there's a way, and that's how I entered the community even in Greenland. That at least allowed me to start work there. And so there's some of those, your own relationship homework that can help bring you into those spaces with some level of trust off the bat. That could maybe, make you be able to develop that grant idea then. Yeah, I agree that it's not structured. And, I'm very concerned about the next International Polar Year because the last one we just saw, this ICARP, this research planning process of priorities, it's unfunded. So we all do it for free. And then magically the International Polar Year comes and millions of dollars are given to researchers who just like parachute into communities and are like, okay, I got my, $5 million grant and I'm here to do this here. And they were never even notified. And so, yeah, the practice is still so problematic.
There is alignment between, what the expectations are, yet what the support is to achieve.
And even at the researcher level, trying to do good at the institutional level, they're not interested in that yet. They want fast results.
Journal articles, very rigid expectations of Western methodological approaches, some are better than others. It's completely drenched in dominant ideology and discourses.
Like that I have a question. I'm conscious we're past 3 o'clock, but it was about dissemination because I was really struck with the point you're making about the kind of Western dominant methodologies, but like our modes of dissemination of knowledge are very, the particular and culturally specific as well. And
Yep.
how does that come into play when working with Indigenous communities? Is dissemination still even relevant because it's participatory or
It's totally, yeah. So instead of like the fact sheet, the brief and the paper or the manuscript, so I asked, what is a useful way for this project to give you information? And for the community I worked with for my dissertation, they wanted it in a format that they could develop into strategic planning. So that looks totally different than what we would normally disseminate. And it centered their ability to do what they wanted to do. So some things that I found really interesting were not as possible for them. So that wasn't as relevant. So in my dissertation, when I put it out there, I shared the community document because it looks really different than a normal method. Other ways, if you're doing projects, like we're doing a current project on education right now, and the results desired by the school are different than the results desired by the parents, which are different than the results desired by the tribe. So that would be 3 separate methods of dissemination that would look different. By the school, it might be a fact sheet. By the tribe, it might be something that can be used for advocacy. And by parents, it might be resources, and it's just asking that can help support that. Then there's also, in Greenland, it was a responsibility that I would present this model and try and broaden that so people would do better. I had 2 things. So I was also asked to go on a news interview. I don't know if it ever got published. And then a totally separate thing, I participated in a local choir, and they wanted recordings of their choir and a picture so they could make CD cases for themselves. And so that seems totally random, but whatever you're asked for is how you're going to contribute. And I had a recording technology, I had a recording device that on a remote island people didn't have. So you can be asked in so many different ways to contribute while you're there. And it's just that willingness to pitch in. Like I said, everybody in the community is responsible for something. Thank you, everybody.